Welcome, Beth. It's so good to see you today.
It's so good to see you, Kimberly. We were blast from the past here because how long has it been since we've known each other? Maybe we don't even mention that.
A long time, a
Yes.
very long time.
Yes, indeed. I went to, I think it was your first yoga studio that you opened, which we just confirmed was on P Street in Washington, D.C., and then became a regular at your, I think it was your second studio, correct? On 17th Street in DC.
Yeah, it was like the fourth iteration of the studio, right? Because it started in living room, church. You were never
Oh,
at the church,
no,
right? No,
no.
okay. Then P Street, then 17th. But yeah, most people just knew 17th or P Street. But
That's right.
it's so funny, Beth, because it's like, your journey and your evolution. And I was saying before we started recording that, I go to LinkedIn a few times a year and you would always pop up. And I was like, oh, she's got such fun material. And it's just, I haven't seen you in years,
Yeah.
right? Since you moved. And so, can you give us a little idea about your background? Because I know you were really helpful with Tranquil Space Foundation
Mhm.
when you were a volunteer with us and kind of cultivating and creating the strategy and plan for it. And then now you're doing all sorts of fun things elsewhere.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm gonna say I may not have a unique story, and that so many women I speak with kind of have a story around burnout at some point. Maybe went into corporate America, became a lawyer, consultant, or what have you, and put in a lot of hours, and at some point realized, okay, what do I really want to do? What fuels me? So I did work for Deloitte Consulting when you and I were sort of in the same city. Really loved it. Kind of had my MBA, put me in there, all work, all hours, and I did. And at some point, I think it caught up with me. About the same time, I was trying to reevaluate. I met my husband, so I had to move to the Midwest that occurred, which really gave me a little bit of space to think about that question. What do I really want to do if I had a blank sheet of paper and could just dream a little bit? And so I started my own business here in Indianapolis. And at that time, it was, well, what do I know how to do? So I can't say it was a thorough business plan, but I knew I had strategic planning. I had performance management experience. I started to parlay that in this new city a little bit. But when I was in DC, I also started getting into this crazy thing called improv comedy. And it's many people know what it is, but if you don't, it's a performance-based art form where scenes are created kind of in the moment. So there's no planning, which for me, I'm a planner, so that was a little bit scary. But I started taking classes, Kimberly, and I fell in love. And so I realized through those courses that I was showing up a lot differently. So to circle back on my story, and I'm happy to share a little bit more of how I started to show up differently. I kind of started to experiment with improv. Well, what can we do to bring improv into business? What about improv and leadership? I thought it was a really original idea. Turns out lots of people are doing it. That's okay. But when I moved, I realized that in answering that question, what do I really want to do? Improv kept coming up. So that was a piece of what I started experimenting with in this new phase of my life. Like, what value does improv have to give leaders and teams, and what can we learn?
Well, and again, as we were talking before we started recording, I have heard nothing but rave reviews
Mm,
about improv. I mean, people I've met over the years, like crediting improv to helping with so many things, right? And so to hear you say this idea, bringing it into kind of like business, I find so
mhm.
fascinating. And yet it does make sense, right? But can you talk a little bit about how you utilize it and why it's so important? Because the people who I can think of off the top of my head who are like,
Mhm.
it blew my mind, we're introverts, right? And to me, I've always been
Ah,
scared to do this because I'm
yes.
like, hey, like I'm a planner too. And I'd have to be like, oh, let me go think about that and come up with a plan and I'll get right back to you to continue this scene. And so I'm curious, like how does this help in business and how do you see people kind of blooming and blossoming in
Yeah.
this process.
Yes, I was one of those people, by the way. Yes, so let me just dispel the notion that I was this super artistic kid growing up, that I was in theater, that I was always in performing arts. I just want to tell you, no, I was a professional, and the idea of getting on a stage, as I mentioned a minute ago, and performing something that's made up was terrifying. I also just happen to love challenges. So I was like, well, if there's fear there, I'll lean into it. So I think let me go back to how I started to show up differently, Kimberly. I felt like before improv, I had to figure it out all by myself. Like somehow I had to have all the solutions, even though I had great team members around me, I wasn't utilizing them. And I also felt like I had a really good script, like you were talking about. So when I'd go into client meetings, I just really wanted to stay to that script. And what do we know? New information arises. People have different perspectives, and we need to adapt and move away from that script, right? So all of that was not winning points with my clients, and I could see that. That's not why I did improv. I did improv just for fun. But what I realized is I did start to evolve. I started to show up in a more authentic way. I was okay asking for help. I was using my team way more effectively than before. And what I noticed is what we were creating together was way more interesting than what I was creating by myself, late night, alone in the office. And so I wanted other people to experience this as leaders and teams as a new way of approaching interactions. So the premise is we are co-creating, right? Which means that we have to let go of a certain amount of control of the outcome. But improvisers also believe if we do that, we're going to get to something in improv funnier, I think in business better, right? More valuable. So let me make it kind of more, maybe more tactical to ground us. There's a set of principles that improvisers use that they have to adhere to, because quite honestly, we have nothing else. So like imagine a blank stage. There's no props, there's nothing. All we have are these principles. And these principles just happen to correlate really great with teamwork. But there are things like make your partner look good. There are things like share control or give control freely, right? There are things like yes and, which Kimberly, you mentioned. This is one that's probably kind of the most well known. And if we follow these principles, we will be able to create something. Now, improv scenes, some are funny, some blow up. That's okay. But we know we will create something together. And so I think for me, the translation to teams and leadership is, trying to use these principles to inspire a bit more openness, a bit more collaboration, and a bit more creativity. So that is what I see when I work with teams. And side note, it is fun because we're doing improv and we're doing improv activities to try and cultivate this muscle. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the beginning of it. And I'm happy to go into like yes and a little bit more because I think that that's a helpful one.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that because, the pieces, because it's also used in therapy, and it's,
Mhm.
a way to not just be like either or this or that, black or
Yes.
white. And so, and I have always heard that it originated from improv. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious how you use it in improv and then how you translate that into business, kind of working with clients and everyday life with your kid, with your husband.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's so applicable across all of those. Yeah. So the best way I can explain it. So let's imagine that I'm on a stage and my scene partner throws out an offer. Let's say they say something like, I'm excited to go camping with you this weekend. Okay. So as improvisers, we have two ways we can respond. We can either block it or accept it. And if we block it, it might sound like, no, you're not excited, or we're not going camping. That's a pretty clear block, right? We can also use this block that's a little more sneaky. It's called yes, but. We talked about this a minute ago. We are all guilty of this one. Let's be clear, it is still a block. So it might sound like, yes, but I was thinking about dinner tonight. Here's what I want to make. Okay. What happens to that original idea is it completely disappears and now we're on to something else. So improvisers don't want to block. We do what's called accepting, and it's not enough to say, yeah, you're excited. To simply say yes is not enough because we need both people to contribute to create something.
Mhm.
So we use what's called yes and, which is, yeah, I hear you. I see you. I see your offer. And I'm going to add my own bit of information to move the scene, in quotes here, forward, right? So I can yes and that particular offer by saying, yes, and such a good time. It's going to be a great time for us to connect because we've been so busy. Yes, and thank you for planning that because it wasn't on my radar and I don't feel like I helped. Yes, and I don't think I want to spend time with you. I'm not sure I'm in love with you anymore. It can be any of those, right? But the idea with yes and is that we are um, in the mindset that, again, we're creating this thing together and we both need to contribute to be able to do it. Another key part is we just have to accept the offer, right? We have to not judge it, but know that all the offers together actually create something. So it's not my job, Kimberly, to say, that is a bad offer. It's not interesting. I got to make my partner look good and I got to trust the process. So I find a way to yes and. Um, Let me see if I can translate that into business because that was part of your question. So I think leaders in business, oftentimes we block without realizing the impact. And we are a culture of no because we like to have certainty and control. So I would say if you're a leader that is trying to inspire a culture of openness, affirmation, and here's the rubber hits the road, right? Creativity, ideas that work and provide value. We want to look for ways to yes and more than we block. And so blocking does have a place in business. We have to say no to projects. We have to say no to a certain price tag of things, etc. I just think, Kimberly, that we have grown accustomed to doing it so much that we default to it. It becomes our go-to response when I would encourage leaders to actually make our go-to response yes and only reserve the blocking for things that really, really matter.
Mm.
Yeah. So it is a little bit in therapy, you might hold it a little bit differently. But I think what is connected with therapy and the improv definition is you're holding a couple different ideas. You're holding that first offer and your second offer, and you're trying to figure out how they connect.
Right, right. Like
Yeah.
an example would be like, oh my gosh, I'm so freaked out about COVID. Right. Of
Right.
course. Right. Yes. And what are some things that we have control over that we can look at to explore, how,
Yeah.
so that we
Creating,
can
so
feel,
the openness that you created just
yes,
in that moment,
right.
I felt like we could have gone a lot of different places. Like I just, yeah, brainstorm, right?
Yeah. Versus, but you're vaccinated. Right. It's
Everything's
like,
fine.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
That's
Exactly.
that's right. So I
Uh,
particularly love the yes and one just because you can see the applicability in all aspects of our lives, and especially with children. Like I've noticed, for all the parents out there listening, that my kids somehow grew up. So they were young, right? 3 and 4. Now they're 6 and 8. But when they were younger, I had to protect them from so many things, like don't go in the street. So my muscle around no was pretty big. I noticed as they grew up, I still was saying no to things that were perfectly okay for them to do, right? Like don't go in the street is like a natural for people, but now they know. And we've been really clear around you can go this point in the neighborhood and this point. So it's like I don't need to say no anymore. I have to catch myself and say, oh yeah, you can. And like remember these are the boundaries. So I think we all can slip into that blocking mentality. We just have to kind of reflect and check ourselves a little bit. What is this situation? Does this situation really need to know?
right. Right. Yes. I like that. Um, and I think it is a really good way to look at it. Cause even I was thinking, as you were saying this about how, in brainstorming, we'll be like, what about this? What about that? And people are like, no, that would never work. Right. And it's like, we're just brainstorming. We're not
Right.
committing, and so even though sometimes you're like, there's no way that could happen, still shutting that person down with no in that moment, I think really thwarts one's creativity.
Mm. Yeah, and I think there's a time and a place for both because we do both brainstorming and innovating and evaluating. I just think they don't have to happen in the same breath. So I think if we could get better about, okay, we're going to spend 20 minutes and there's maybe some of the constraints are off. We're going to try and yes and each other. And then don't worry, we are going to put it through some evaluation criteria, but I think there aren't enough beats, if you will, between the idea and the evaluating. Sometimes enough, Kimberly, that we even know what we're talking about. Someone might say something, we're like, no, but do we even understand what that idea is? Let's explore it a little bit.
Right, right. Yeah, such a good piece. And
Mhm.
one of the things that you brought up too is kind of creativity at work and helping people. I mean, it does seem like that's something that you do through your
Yes.
business. And
Yeah.
how do you encourage people, particularly, any of our listeners that may feel like I'm not creative,
I
right?
know.
How do you help people who don't identify as creative tap into their creativity?
hmm Um, I have like a sneaky way I do it, I think, which is I just assume that everyone is because they are. Uh, so my approach with a lot of my sessions and with my clients is we're gonna do this thing now. And then we do this thing. Let me say it's my job to create psychological safety in the room. It's my job to create the right conditions that people feel like they can take a little bit of a risk, and then I assume that they are, and it's amazing how people opt in and show up in that regard. I also like to make the point just that research shows we are all creative when we are born. I think what happens is we're taught out of it, if you will. So whether that be your family or a company culture, we are taught to follow the rules and to go from A to B to C to D, however you want to define that, which sort of sucks the creativity out of us, but it's always there. We never lose it. And it's something that we can continue to cultivate. And it sometimes I do this simple activity where I have people sketch out a drawing of like you, I would sketch you, right? Like I would draw you and then I would show you, like I'd hold it up and say, okay, this is my drawing. And the drawings that people do are so fun and so creative. But the bummer part is usually it follows with people saying, I'm so sorry. Like I'm so sorry about how I drew you. And it's like I want to hold everyone and hug them after that.
Mhm.
Actually, because it's like, no, what you did is so great. Like my kids, even at their age, they're still not totally developed out, right? Of that creativity. So like it doesn't matter what they do. They're like, look what I did, mommy. Look at this thing that I drew. And I'm kind of looking at wondering what is it exactly? But it doesn't matter. It's like I think that there's such value in getting it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great reminder of like, rather than, perfectionism, right? And rather than things having to be absolutely perfect before it goes into the world in any
Yes.
capacity, it's like, okay, how can I do my very first, like, product or, curriculum, right? Knowing that it's going to be tweaked based on feedback and what have you, but good enough sometimes is good enough, right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm curious if you use that with all that you put out in the world, but this idea of let me iterate and have kind of a straw man or a prototype and then put it out there and see what the reaction is. I'm in a group of other consultants and we talk about this idea of don't develop it, test the market first. So if there's like an idea that you have and then people are actually purchasing it, you know that you're onto something. And then if people actually buy it, then then develop it, almost
Right.
almost to that extreme. Because so many of us have developed something, so to your point, Kimberly, so perfect, and then you put it out and no one wants it. And you're like, oh, that was a big waste of time. Yeah.
Absolutely. I feel like I first heard that concept with Tim Ferriss's 4 Hour Work Week.
Yeah.
You've probably read that.
I did, but it's been a while since I
Yeah.
have read that book. Yeah.
Such a good book, because I'd never thought of that. I was always like, oh, you create it, you put it out there, or maybe you create like the first 3 modules or something, and then the first 3 chapters, right? That's what you do when you write a book proposal. And so you get like a little sample just to make sure you're onto the right thing. And then you can go from there and build
Yeah.
out from there based on feedback. Yeah, it's so important. And yet I think so many people do feel like, no, I have to have the perfect website before it goes out there or what have you. And
Mhm.
people are like, just start the freaking landing page and collect email addresses,
That's right. Start simple. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so he talks about that in the 4 Hour Work Week.
The
That
importance of
concept.
the
Yeah.
prototype. And I had never heard that before, but the idea was like, right, you sell something, see if you get enough interest, and then
Yeah.
you create it. And I was like, what? Like mind blown. I remember, gosh, when did that book come out? Early 2000s, I
Yeah.
think.
It's been out a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's taking hold a little bit more now. Side note, just in COVID, this notion of I've just heard more people talking about moving from 5 day to 4 day.
And he's 4 hour.
Oh yeah, he is 4 hour. Thank you for that reminder. But you can't go there in one night. So it's like
No,
we're just slowly trying to inch our way to sanity, aren't we?
totally. And I remember how shocking, of course, I mean, of course, 4 hour is shocking, but even for a day, I mean, it's so freaking
It is.
genius,
Yeah. Yeah. Genius and crazy to some. But I will say, and I know we're going on a little bit of a tangent, but I will say I think we're more ready for it. Like if there is any sort of light that's come out of COVID, which maybe there just isn't a lot, but this idea that we need balance, we need downtime, we need to take care of our lives. That includes work, but it includes much, much, much more than that, like our families, our health. And so I've seen in the focus on mental health as well. I think coming out has been because it's been so hard for so many people. I think we are, as a society, slightly more open about it, and I think that's good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's so good. And I do think this like, pause to really check in with your values. And, it's like, how are you spending your time? How are you spending your life? Does it align with how you really want to be or show up in the world? So yeah, no, I think it is all like so, so important. And if that includes a 4 day or a 4 hour work week, that's freaking amazing.
Well, you heard it here. Kimberly and
Right.
Beth fully support it. I mean, even if your company doesn't, we
Yeah.
do.
Right, right. And you
We
know
do.
what too, and we had talked a little bit about this before we started recording of spending all day in meetings. And you think
Yes.
about it, could you have, and again, this may not be possible for everyone, but like if you are in meetings all day, could you have 4 days of meetings and 1 day of like creative open space where you block it out fully? You are not available for meetings. Or,
Mhm.
typically people say, that you're most creative kind of in the morning. Could you not schedule meetings until 11 or noon or something that would just allow you to use that time and space? And I know for everyone that's not
Mhm.
possible, but can you
Mhm.
speak a little bit to that, right? Of the challenges of staying connected in the COVID world and post COVID world, hopefully, but also like why it's so important that we also create space within this
Mm.
connection.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I've experienced it, and so many of my clients that I work with have this notion of kind of the hey, how you doing? Let's connect has maybe fallen by the wayside with just back to back Zoom calls each day. If there was an opportunity to design your schedule, I think it is now, from the standpoint of there is a recognition more that remote work is causing us to need to do more things during the day potentially and have a more blended life. So obviously there's alignment with the people you work with around your schedule that's needed when you're available or not. But if you do your best work at night, I think there may be more of an opportunity now than ever to be able to do that. When we were going in the office every day, it's just different, right? It's not as much there. So yeah, one of the things that I've seen a demand for recently is just this: how do you do work and life? How do you integrate? How do you make remote work for you? Um, I so we got COVID puppies. We got a puppy like 7, 8 months ago. So one thing that I've been really loving to do is just take a walk midday, because now I'm kind of forced to, because she needs exercise. So nothing like something that needs exercise to force us to do it. So I have to go on a walk and take her out, but that is my time to just disconnect for a moment. I think for those people who are listening who are really into working out, this idea of taking a class in the middle of the day or maybe mid-morning, but it starts with, what do we need to fuel us? So that reflection has to happen first. Like, what do you as an individual need to feel like you have the energy and the mental clarity to get done all the things you need to do? And what I notice for myself and others is that we just fall off, right? Like, we'll do it for a week and we fall off. In my mind, I don't care. It's about the next thing that you do. So it's like, okay, recommit. Now it's a Monday again, and trying to integrate those throughout your week and just commit to it, Kimberly, because I think when people are busy, it's the first thing to go, are things like our mental health, our physical health. And when we get busy, those things actually need to rise to the top because we need them even more.
Absolutely.
What do you do, Kimberly? Tell us,
Yeah.
what are your things?
Well, have you read the book Burnout by the two sisters?
Heard of it, haven't
Yeah.
read it.
So it's so good. And I saw her via Zoom
Oh,
speak last weekend at
yeah.
a therapy conference. And this piece on burnout, she talks about how there's stress cycles, right? And you need to complete the stress cycle in order to start again. And so many of us are not completing that stress cycle. And it's 10 hours a day, and 8 of them ideally are sleeping, right? So it's 2 hours of doing other things that are really important, whether or not that's connection, exercise, things along those lines. I think she has a list of like 8 or 10.
Okay.
But anyway, for me, I mean, it's definitely like getting out in nature when I can, surrounding myself with beautiful things. I've got like pink tulips and yellow tulips right there. My creature comforts, having those within reach. And then also, as much as possible, I mean, I've been really into ballet lately. So carving out my daily ballet time, and they're all, virtual classes. And of course, time with my dogs, which you probably have heard him snoring
Mhm.
throughout the session or throughout
Adorable.
our time together. But, those are all ways that are really, so it's exercise. I love me some sleep, beautiful things that are not expensive, just like nice little
Mhm.
sweet things. Like, for example, this kombucha I discovered in New York City. And I was like, oh my God, the can,
Oh,
everything.
that looks like art.
It's
Like just
art.
pure art. Yeah.
And then it's freaking jasmine rose kombucha. So I'm
Whew.
like, don't mind if I do. And I bought a case. And, it's like just little things like that, just little joys, that are a couple dollars, but they can make a really big difference. That's always been my kind of
Go to.
go to for
Yeah.
sure.
So in burnout, then, are they saying that each day we all need 2 hours of that time, whatever that looks like for each person? But it's connecting, it's moving our body, it's the stuff that's going to fuel us.
Yeah. So I must confess, I'm 10% into the book, so I can't fully speak on
Okay,
it,
fair
but
enough, fair enough. Yeah.
that's what
But
I've
I mean, that's
gathered.
it. The reason I was asking is
Yeah.
because that's really good for us and the listeners to consider, is just where are we now? Like, I think for many of us, we'd say we are like not at all there, or like 10% there. But I'm kind of goal focused. So I love having, ooh, can I get to that? Like, can I get to that 2 hours a day?
If you're sleeping 8, right? And some people like
Yeah.
sleep 6. So it's like, okay, are these 4 hours engaged in other things?
Yeah.
And again, I'm sorry, I can't tell you off the top of my head what those things are, but it's at the very beginning of the book. And and she has a TED talk too, where she talked about it. And listeners,
Mm.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But yeah, just so interesting, right? As we think about, improv, creativity, showing up. And it's like, all right, well, when we're burned out, we're not going to be able to show up fully.
No, no. Yeah. yeah, there's not a lot of creativity when I'm in survival mode. And I think that's just how it works. It's sort of the amygdala, right? The threat response. We
Yeah.
freeze and we're not using our most creative selves. But when we can get past survival, which requires some of these self-care techniques, right? Then we can start to step into this space of like what's possible. And then I think like the yes and the really showing up as leaders, with the right attitude that's going to inspire others. By the way, none of these things are easy, but I think as leaders we do have that responsibility to try and show up as our best every day. Then we get to the good stuff for sure.
Well, as leaders, as
Yeah.
parents of fur babies, of like as partners, as friends, as family members, as people connected in their communities, right? It's like, when we're showing up as 10% or 20% of our best
Yeah.
self, it takes a toll, on our relationships and obviously our well-being.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, so I was gonna challenge Kimberly to take an intro to improv class because she said it sounded scary. I was mentioning to her also that, it's so in COVID, a lot of like Second City improv classes, for example, have gone online. So if anyone's interested, it's a really good time because things that would have to be face to face where you had to travel, now you can actually do it on Zoom, which I wouldn't thought would have been effective before, but I've taken the classes in the last couple of years and they're amazing. So something for you to think about, Kimberly.
Absolutely. And Beth, would you send me a link to the
Yeah,
different venues that you mentioned?
I
Because
will.
I hadn't even thought about that as one of the many businesses that had to transition online, during all of
Yeah.
this. And in a way, it's been such a gift, because it's like I take ballet classes with a teacher in New York, it's like all these sorts of things. And in Miami and St. Louis, and, would have never connected with these people without this
Mhm.
experience of having been forced to go online. So, my last question for you, Beth, is the name of
Yeah.
the podcast, of course, is Tranquility du Jour. And I'm curious, how do you find tranquility in your everyday?
That's such a good question. The walks that I mentioned give me that space. I try and not have my phone with me because it's a different quality. Like just that I can hear, like right now in Indiana, it's getting warmer. So like the birds are out, the snow is not on the ground. Like I'm attuned to that. So that really does make me feel a bit more centered. And then if I can have moments now outside with my boys where we're just in the moment playing, I feel that presence. So those are my moments right now.
Well, I love that as a reminder of being fully in the moment, which is not easy, right? We're great at
No.
multitasking. So when you are walking your dog, walking your dog, when you're playing with your child, playing with your child, connecting with your child. And it's like, it's such an important thing. And yet so challenging for many of us to do. So thank you for mentioning that.
Oh, yes, of course. And thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy to see you again and to have a inspiring conversation.
Well, thank you for all the wonderful things you put out on LinkedIn and Instagram. And so, listeners, I'll put a link to both of those, of course, in the show notes. Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you, Kimberly. Hope we get to do it again soon.
Absolutely.